While I was posing and messing around with this figure, there was literally a brief moment where I actually thought about choke slamming it. I literally envisioned it because this is one of the most frustrating action figures that I have ever encountered from the Star Wars Black Series line. Now, look, I'll be brutally honest with you guys. I was pretty excited about this figure. I've never owned a Battledroid. I know they've been released and then re-released and then released again. I think there was like a single pack, a two pack, and then eventually they did like a retro card for like a episode 1 anniversary or something along those lines. But I didn't pick up any of those. This was going to be my first ever Battledroid experience, so I'm not really going to get too in depth with the articulation and things of that nature because it's basically just a repaint from the original. And if you guys have ever watched any of my content, you guys will know or at least be familiar with my concept or my idea in terms of repaints. I really have no issues with them as long as it's a new character or as long as they're adding value to our display. I really have no issues with that because I think it makes perfect sense. And I did mention this in a previous video, but I think the Marvel Legends, the new body mold for the Hulk is an absolutely perfect example of that. It's just a really, really well-designed figure. I love the reverse butterfly joints. Great ankle pivoting and rotation. Overall, it's just a very well done figure, and I love the fact that they decided to reuse that body mold. Same thing with some of the Spider-Man body molds. I know they did. They reused it for the Marvel Legends, one of the newer Deadpools as well. So that type of reuse or those type of repaints are okay with me. I have literally no issues with it if you're adding value to a display. But I've also given really bad examples of repaints. For example, the Platinum Edition gray ugly action figures from McFarlane, or some of the gold action figures that he's been released that are basically just all gold. I think he mostly did that at the beginning of his acquisition of the multiverse, but it's just a perfect example of what bad repaints look like. I had no issues with this repaint. It's basically based on the Fallen Order video game franchise, which personally I'm not really that big of a fan of. I could take it or leave it. I did play the original. What's pretty good, I loved the concept of it. I just didn't love the execution. I thought it was very linear and kind of boring, and the mechanics just didn't feel right to me. But I'm not here to review the video game for you guys. I'm just here to give you guys my personal opinion on this figure. And like I said, it's just a repaint from the original as far as I'm concerned. And I honestly don't know exactly where to start with this figure. I don't love the pack that he comes with, which is just white plastic. There's no paint added to it. There's no details to it. The ankle pivoting or the rotation on the ankle is almost non-existent. You can barely get him into any poses. There's no butterfly joint, so the arms can't move forward or backward or out to the side too much. They kind of just go in somewhat of a rotation. The head also cannot move to the side very well. It does have a kind of like a dumbbell joint up there, but you can't really get him to look to the sides. You struggle a lot. And then there are no swivels where you really need swivels. To me, the biggest issue or the biggest drawback for this figure had to be the hands, because you are going to have an absolute struggle. It's literally going to take an engineer to figure out how this dude is supposed to hold his blaster. You can port it in there pretty easily, but if you want to get him into some like running poses or any type of a semblance of an action pose, the blaster is just going to fall out of his hands. You're basically going to have to pose him in like a very neutral stance and not really move him around too much. The pose where I had him walking or running constantly had the blaster slipping out of his fingers. So it was just an incredibly frustrating figure. By the way, I did a little bit of research, and look, I could be wrong. Like I said, I'm not very experienced in the video game franchise, but I think there's an alternate version of this character that has some sort of melee weapon. So they probably could have just thrown in that accessory. I'm going to just take a guess and say that Hasbro was probably saving that version for an alternate repaint. Maybe just give him like some scuff marks or some battle damage and then just add the melee weapon. But they could have just easily added the weapon here and saved everybody some time, and it would have added even more value. I think people would have bought more of these just for the sake of being able to army build with them. Even if you're not a fan of the video game, it's still a property of the Star Wars universe, and so you could easily have these display incredibly well. I know a lot of people complain that this is the exact same body mold. I don't really have a problem with that if it's just a repaint. I just think that the original had way too many issues to just ignore and continue using it. So personally, I think they could have gone back, re-engineered some stuff, and then made it to be a little bit more articulated. And I get it. The figure in it of itself, or the character, is just a very difficult body mold to work with. There's definitely going to have to be a lot of engineering that goes into it just because of how sleek and slender the figure is. So I honestly wouldn't have had that many issues if the articulation was limited. But for example, he was able to hold his blaster well enough, or he was able to look to the side at least a little bit more. I would have had no issues with this figure. But as I said, to me, it just piles on. And at the end of the day, I think it really sours the experience. Now, I personally picked this up for an absolute steal at GameStop. This was like towards the end when the figure was like just about to get out of stock. And so I was able to pick up a couple of these. But for anybody that ended up paying the full retail, I honestly don't know what to say to you. I mean, that's almost $30. But that's usually what happens when you get a store exclusive. Only time will tell what people actually think of this figure. I do think that people's perspective might switch on this if we eventually see this character in like a live action adaptation or a live action film, or maybe more animated series appearances. We did see a lot of that with some of the stormtroopers or clone troopers that were featured eventually on that were gaming greats that were eventually featured on like an animated series. I believe they were some of them were featured on like the Bad Batch animated series, and then a lot of those spiked up in value later in time. But there's really no need to pick this up, in my personal opinion, unless you're able to find it for a really good deal. As I said, I was able to pick these up for well under $10, so for that price point, I really don't have that many issues. But the figure is definitely lackluster. You're going to have a ton of issues posing it. I will say that even though the figure is very frustrating to own, I think it's a really cool army builder. It adds a little bit of flair to your display, especially if you're adding him to some other battle droids like from the movie or the Clone Wars versions. You won't be staring at the same monotonous, repetitive color. This will, like I said, add a little bit of flavor to your display. So all in all, if you're able to find it for under $10, I would still pick it up. This to me is a perfect example of a decent reuse. It's not perfect just because the body mold isn't great, but I do love the fact that they manufactured a brand new version of a Battledroid. But let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section. By the way, if you guys are enjoying the reviews of action figures, I don't really consider myself like a reviewer per se, but I do enjoy unboxing and telling you guys my personal thoughts on some of these figures. If you guys enjoy that type of content, let me know down below, because I can continue doing this kind of stuff. Like I said, really do enjoy it. As always, if you guys enjoy the content, you guys can always hit the like button, subscribe, continue to support the channel that way, and stay tuned because we definitely have a ton of new content coming at you guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.